Hello learners, welcome to the course Migrated Women's Literature. In our today's lecture, we would talk about South Asian diaspora literature. In the previous lecture, we had discussed about South Asian migration to Canada. We had also talked about different phases of Indian migration to Canada. Along with that, we had discussed about Canadian immigration policy. In today's lecture, we would talk about South Asian diasporic literature. The political policy of multiculturalism adopted by Canada to ensure that all multicultural groups occupy an equally significant space on a horizontal plane. But in the actual practice of day-to-day living, different ethnic groups occupy different spaces in the social system. This means that while the policy promotes equality and representation in principle, the lived reality often sees varying levels of integration and visibility for different ethnic communities within the broader societal framework. The South Asian migration to Canada established a diaspora whose immediate need was to articulate its feelings, emotions, and responses to the new society. Here, Charles Larson, in his essay Multiculturalism and Politics of Recognition, has projected the significance of recognition and how it becomes a tool in the hands of the mainstream to marginalize minority literature. The basic requirement of an individual or a diaspora is formulating its identity and the recognition of its existence as an entity. This requirement is fulfilled by the South Asian Canadian writers who are producing a lot of literature in different languages such as Punjabi, which is also known as Gurmukhi, Gujarati, Bengali, etc., and also in English. The work produced in regional languages, however, remains confined to ethnic groups and is published by ethnic publishing houses, often with support from multilingual and multicultural departments. It is the South Asian literature written in English by writers of the South Asian diaspora which has caught the eye of the general public. This is the sphere in which the writer has made his or her identity and presence felt to the world at large, and not just to his or her own ethnic community. It has brought not only fame and recognition to its writers, but has also brought the aspirations and tribulations of the South Asian diaspora to the notice of the world. Diane McGifford emphasizes the characteristic feature of the South Asians as the desire to retain their own identity and not to be refashioned as Anglo or Franco-Canadians. She describes them as vibrant, talented people schooled in the literary forms of their indigenous and adopted languages, in the vernacular forms of English and in the traditional forms of English literature. There are various famous South Asian writers like M.G. Vasanji, Rohinton Misri, Neil Bisundat, Uma Parmeswaran, Himani Banerjee, Lakshmi Gill, and many others. They have projected the dilemmas and the struggles of the South Asian diaspora, thereby giving their ethnic existence a voice. The marginalization confronted by these diasporic people induces them to stay in close clusters and effectively create islands within society, where they try to establish small replicas of their homelands. They have projected the dilemmas and the struggles of the South Asian diaspora, thereby giving their ethnic existence a voice. This is where the literatures of the different diasporas settled in Canada become important, since they give a voice to the individual experiences of the minority groups, the pain and anxieties of people who experience the binaries of social interaction, Their writings exhibit the negative as well as the positive nuances of behavioral patterns of the mainstream Canadians as well as immigrants of different nationalities. We know that Sikhs who migrated to Canada in the first phase were mostly illiterate villagers. So, writing in that era was nearly impossible. Maluka is the first novel to be written by a South Asian diaspora writer, S.S. Dhami. He came to Canada to enroll at the University of Toronto for his doctorate in philosophy, and the degree was awarded to him in 1937. The novel is based on autobiographical details and depicts the life of the all-male Sikh community living in British Columbia during the early years of the 20th century. Though the novel was published as late as 1978, it was written around in 1920s. The novel had recorded the experience of the Sikh community in Canada. Maluka is a sole example of an almost autobiographical account presented in fiction. An account of personal history that reveals the difficult conditions, social as well as psychological, under which the Sikh community lived in the early part of the 20th century. There is no other written work of the period from the 1900s to the 1950s, which has come to light so far, and it was only from the 1960s onwards that the main bulk of South Asian writing started being produced. This gap highlights the challenges faced by the earlier migrants in documenting their experiences and the gradual emergence of South Asian diaspora literature in subsequent decades. This perspective underscores how ethnic literature reflects and intertwines with historical experiences, offering insights into the lived realities of marginalized communities. Each voice of Canadian writers speaks to the unique conditions of South Asian Canadian experience and writing. When the work is situated outside of Canada, frequently in the writer's birth country, this uniqueness is evident. Take for instance Rohinton Misri's Tales from Firoz Shah Bagh, which is set in a Bombay tenement. It was written in Canada by Canadian author, document and rely on experience, especially the luck of distant lands. Here, Canadian society remains unaffected, and citizens are free to express their outrage as well as to relish the works, enlightening cultural originality. However, one of the main goals of these writers is to portray the uniqueness of the South Asian immigrant experience in Canada, a uniqueness that makes the majority of them cringe and feel humiliated. South Asians living in Canada typically find that the country's harsh, frigid weather is suppressed by the icy, hostile social media in which they experience double marginalization. First, as immigrants, and second, as members of racial, frequently linguistic, and typically religious minority. Alternatively, racism and bigotry may be more covert. Mainstream Canadians may be overtly hostile, viewing South Asians as just too different, the wrong kind of immigrants. Regardless of the manifestation of intolerance, its consequences are well known, and it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that South Asian Canadian writers have found that their lives, politics, and artistic expression have been greatly influenced by their alienation as immigrants and the harsh realities of racism and religious prejudice. Naturally, there are benefits to writing for marginalized groups. More on this later. But social, religious, or racial themes do not appear in all of South Asian Canadian writers' works. Not all of these authors are obviously and loudly political. As many passionate lyrics about domestic issues as he does overtly political poetry are written by Rain Cruz, Lakshmi Gill, and Uma Parmeswaran also occur. The term South Asian Canadian literature describes works by Canadian authors who originate in one of the nations that make up the Indian subcontinent. These authors may have arrived in Canada directly through formal British colonial status or indirectly through connections with the Caribbean, the Pacific Islands, East or South Africa, or the United Kingdom. Then the phrase South Asian refers solely to roots, not to a particular region, a national group, or a particular religion. For example, it's important to note that many of the authors here have never traveled to the South Asian nations of their forefathers. And in many instances, entire family generations have moved across continents, for example, from India to England to Canada. That is all for today. We will connect again in some other lectures. Thank you.